Hey guys, tonight we're slipping back into a time when Europe is a simmering cauldron of ambition, resentment, and dread. You can almost smell the cigarette smoke curling in the chambers where politicians argue over treaties they no longer believe in. The streets are full of marching boots. Newspaper headlines scream about appeasement, and you stand at the edge of history with a gnawing feeling in your gut that something monumental, and probably catastrophic, is about to erupt. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop your location and the local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge along cobbled streets in Munich, brushing past crowds captivated by Hitler's fiery oratory. His voice crackles through cheap radios, promising a restored Germany. Underneath the surface, Europe's great powers are playing an elaborate and doomed game of pretend stability. France still mourns its World War I dead. Britain clings to its empire while glancing nervously east, and the Soviet Union eyes everyone with suspicion that borders on paranoia. It's 1936, and in the Rhineland, German troops violate the Treaty of Versailles without firing a shot. You watch them cross the bridges with all the brazen confidence of men who know no one will stop them. A mainstream historical fact, Britain and France could have forced them back with barely a skirmish, but instead, they issue warnings as thin as cigarette paper. Historians still argue whether this single failure emboldened Hitler more than any other event. Soon, fascism blooms like a toxic weed across Europe. Italy under Mussolini struts into Ethiopia, flexing colonial muscle while the League of Nations stamps its feet impotently. You sip bitter coffee in a smoky Viennese cafe, overhearing anxious talk about German expansion. Quirky tidbit. Rumor claims Nazi agents used astrology charts to guide diplomatic timing, though you suspect their real power came from military buildup, not star signs. By 1938, the world watches Germany swallow Austria in the Anschluss. You pass jubilant crowds waving swastika flags, but a hollow note hums beneath the cheers. Next comes the Sudetenland crisis. The Munich Agreement hands over part of Czechoslovakia without a single Czech invited to the table. The West calls it peace for our time. You call it wishful thinking. Your heart thuds as you leaf through newspapers predicting calm. In secret, generals are sketching plans and running war games. Factories hum with fresh munitions. Everyone pretends they can bargain with an ideology that wants nothing less than total domination. In this tense prelude, shadows stretch across Europe. Spanish Civil War volunteers, clandestine arms shipments, and quiet men in bowler hats, trading secrets in smoky backrooms. One evening, you glimpse the flicker of fear in a British envoy's eyes as he boards a night train bound for Berlin. He carries promises that will prove as fragile as autumn leaves. Time winds forward to 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact stuns the world. A cynical handshake between mortal enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, agreeing to carve up Poland like a roast at Sunday dinner. You almost laugh at the hypocrisy if it weren't so chilling. Summer ends. On September 1st, dawn breaks with a thunder of artillery. Columns of German tanks roll into Poland, and the war no one believed would happen crashes into brutal reality. As you listen to panicked radio bulletins, you realize there's no turning back. One last moment before the deluge. In London, Prime Minister Chamberlain declares war. You sit by the wireless, hard in your throat, feeling the old world splinter under the weight of its own delusions. You barely catch your breath as the tanks churn Poland's fields into a mire of crushed harvests and burning villages. This is blitzkrieg, lightning war, and it feels like watching an avalanche consume a valley before anyone can shout a warning. You trudge alongside refugees stumbling toward the horizon, their carts piled with whatever scraps of home they could salvage. German panzer divisions spearhead the assault, roaring past horse-drawn Polish cavalry. Mainstream historical fact, The myth says Polish lancers charge tanks with sabers, but the truth is more nuanced. They aim to ambush infantry, not armored columns. Still, the image of brave men on horseback vanishing under steel treads sears itself into your mind. You can almost taste the dust kicked up by endless columns of troops. Dive bombers scream overhead, their sirens, nicknamed Jericho trumpets, wailing like banshees. You throw yourself into a ditch as bombs crater the road. In just weeks, Poland's resistance is shattered. Historians still argue whether the West could have mounted any meaningful intervention before Warsaw fell. By October, German soldiers parade through conquered cities, while Soviet troops seize Poland's eastern half. You slip past a checkpoint at night, clutching a smuggled newspaper that shows Hitler and Stalin grinning beside the newly redrawn map. For all the world's grand declarations, no army has come to save the Poles. Then, almost as abruptly as it began, the front falls silent. This is the phony war, when Britain and France declare war, but seem unwilling to actually fight it. You pace the length of the Maginot Line, fortresses bristling with guns pointed east, but the Germans simply go around it, like a cunning fox slipping past a henhouse. Come spring 1940, the Blitzkrieg machine revs up again. You find yourself in Denmark on the morning of April 9th, as German paratroopers drop from the sky, capturing airfields before breakfast. By nightfall, Denmark surrenders with barely a fight. Norway falls soon after, despite British efforts to hold the ports. Then the true hammer blow, May 10th. You stand among anxious Belgian civilians as panzer columns surge through the Ardennes. Terrain everyone insisted was impassable for tanks. That confidence evaporates in days. In France, chaos erupts. You sprint for cover as Stuka dive bombers smash bridges and strafe convoys of terrified refugees. Quirky tidbit: some French units tried to camouflage trucks by painting windows and doors onto them, hoping German pilots would mistake them for buildings from the air. It worked about as well as you'd expect. German forces split Allied armies in two, racing to the Channel. Soon, you're pinned down near Dunkirk, watching columns of smoke climb into the sky as the British Expeditionary Force scrambles to escape. Historians still debate whether Hitler deliberately delayed his armour to let Britain withdraw. Some say it was a gesture to encourage peace. Others call it a blunder of hubris. Operation Dynamo begins, and you wade into the shallow surf, boots heavy with seawater and fear. Civilian boats, fishing vessels, pleasure yachts, old steamers chug across the channel under Luftwaffe attack. Plucking soldiers from the beaches, you haul yourself over the side of a trawler, lungs burning, and watch France's coast recede behind a curtain of smoke and flame. As June dawns, France collapses. German troops march under the Arc de Triomphe, while Marshal Pétain's new government sues for peace. You stand in the shadows, feeling the continent tilt under your feet. The once unthinkable has happened. Hitler controls nearly all of Western Europe. A thin thread of hope holds fast across the Channel. Britain refuses to yield, though the price of defiance will soon become terrifyingly clear. You sense the shape of what's coming. Cities burned from the sky, families huddled in underground stations, the Luftwaffe's storm gathering strength. But for now, you exhale shakily, exhausted by the sheer velocity of conquest. The Blitzkrieg has redrawn the map in mere months, leaving the world stunned by how quickly peace can vanish into dust and fire. You feel the salt-laden breeze as you climb a narrow coastal path in southern England, scanning the Channel's grey expanse for any sign of invasion barges. It's midsummer 1940, and Britain stands alone, a single island fortress glaring back at the Nazi colossus. The beaches are mined, the harbours barricaded, and everywhere you look, sandbags and slit trenches sprout like weeds. Night after night, the wail of air raid sirens sends you scrambling for cover. In London, you huddle beneath an underground station platform, the tiled walls vibrating with each distant impact. Mainstream historical fact: between September and May, the Blitz kills over 40,000 British civilians. You try not to count the hours between the all-clear signals. By day, the Battle of Britain rages in the skies, You crane your neck to follow the dogfights, silvery contrails twisting above fields of ripening wheat. Spitfires and hurricanes slash through bomber formations, their machine guns hammering in short, brutal bursts. Historians still argue whether radar or sheer pilot courage proved the decisive factor in this airborne duel. Sometimes you swear you can feel the concussive thump of a Messerschmitt spiraling down in flames, hitting the earth with a roar that rattles your bones. One evening, you help pull dazed survivors from a bombed-out row of houses. Soot caked into the lines of your palms. A little girl clutches a cracked teacup as if it's the last solid thing in the universe. Quirky tidbit. To keep morale up, the BBC broadcasts absurdly cheery gardening programs in between casualty reports. You half expect them to recommend petunias for craters, and still, life insists on continuing. Milk deliveries appear on shattered doorsteps. Buses detour around smouldering streets. The government prints leaflets warning about gas attacks that never come, but somehow feel imminent. You spend long hours perched on a rooftop observation post, scanning the sky through binoculars. Each contrail could be friend or foe. Each drone of engines could herald death or salvation. When the bombs fall, they shatter more than masonry. They crack the illusion that Britain is invincible. On a rare clear dawn, you watch Prime Minister Churchill stride past sandbagged corridors, cigar clenched in his teeth. His voice, growling through the radio, dares the Nazis to try an invasion. We shall fight on the beaches. You feel the words settle into your bones, equal parts promise and challenge. Outside London, the countryside braces for paratroopers. You help string barbed wire across a meadow, glancing over your shoulder as if Fallschirmjäger might drop from the clouds any minute. In every village hall, old veterans teach locals to handle rifles and Molotov cocktails, just in case. The Luftwaffe tries to break the will of the cities, turning the docks into infernos. But when dawn follows each night of fire, Londoners emerge from the underground, dusty but defiant. Historians still debate whether the Blitz was intended to force surrender or simply terrorize the population into chaos. One evening in December, you help haul buckets of water in a bucket chain to save what's left of St. Paul's Cathedral. Flames lick the skyline, but somehow the great dome endures, rising above the smoke like a symbol no bomb can erase. You take heart in tiny acts of stubborn normalcy. A woman sets out a tray of tea on the rubble of her front steps. Children play hopscotch across cratered pavements. In defiance of the darkness, blackout curtains twitch open just enough to let a candle flicker. As 1940 wanes, you realize Britain has survived the storm. Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion, fades into the realm of what if. The price has been staggering, but the island has not fallen. And though the war will soon rage far beyond these shores, you know the world will never forget the summer when a handful of pilots and a nation's grit held the line against tyranny. You stand at the edge of a vast plain in the early hours of June 22nd, 1941. A pale dawn spreads across the endless fields of Eastern Europe, so quiet you can hear the dew sliding from tall grass. Then, without warning, the guns erupt. Operation Barbarossa has begun. 3 million German troops pour across the border into the Soviet Union, the largest land invasion in history. You feel the earth shudder beneath waves of tanks, trucks, and marching infantry columns. Mainstream historical fact: the front stretches over 1,800 miles, from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. It's an invasion on a scale nobody has ever attempted. German generals are convinced this lightning strike will topple the Soviet colossus in a matter of weeks. You hike alongside panzer divisions slicing through Belarus, watching towns vanish under artillery fire. Luftwaffe squadrons hammer Soviet airfields, destroying hundreds of planes on the ground. The Red Army reels backward, its soldiers poorly equipped, stunned by the sheer ferocity of the assault. Quirky tidbit: German soldiers were issued instruction leaflets explaining how to behave in the Soviet Union, including warnings against fraternizing with locals or being contaminated by communist ideas. You imagine the irony of reading that while your stomach growls, half the rations spoiled by the summer heat. By July, You slog through conquered villages where scorched cottages lean drunkenly among fields of sunflowers. Refugees flee east, their carts loaded with icons, samovars, and children blinking at the columns of grey-uniformed men. Historians still argue whether Stalin was truly shocked by the attack or simply paralyzed by indecision after countless warnings. The Wehrmacht advances so fast that supply lines can't keep up. You see soldiers strip clocks, boots, and even livestock from captured towns. In Smolensk, you slip into a burned-out house, the wallpaper curling from the walls in heat-warped spirals. A single rocking chair remains intact, gently swaying as if someone has just stood up to fetch water. Summer melts into autumn. The Soviets regroup, mounting counterattacks that feel more desperate than organized. Yet each week, the Germans push deeper toward Moscow, believing the capital's fall will be the final blow. You ride in the back of a supply truck past columns of Soviet prisoners, thousands of hollow-eyed men stumbling west under guard. Mainstream historical fact: by December, German forces have captured over 3 million Soviet soldiers. The scale of suffering defies comprehension. As September ends, the Germans lay siege to Leningrad, a city of culture and revolution. You can almost taste the iron in the air as artillery pounds the outskirts. Yet Stalin refuses to evacuate civilians. Soon this beautiful city will starve behind its own barricades. The advance on Moscow continues, but autumn rains churn roads into a sucking quagmire. Tanks bog down axle deep. You spend hours trying to pull vehicles free with cables that snap under the weight. Quirky tidbit: German soldiers called the gluey mud Rasputitsa, the season of bad roads, a natural defense as effective as any army. As November's cold tightens its grip, winter uniforms arrive too late. You huddle in a shallow trench, frost creeping into your bones, while the temperature plunges below -20 degrees Celsius. Soviet reinforcements arrive from Siberia, fresh troops accustomed to the cold. Historians still debate whether Hitler underestimated Soviet resilience or overestimated his own supply chain. Snow drifts pile as high as tank turrets. Engines freeze solid overnight. You watch your breath crystallize as Moscow's defenses stiffen. Red Army soldiers counterattack with grim determination, pushing the invaders back from the city's edge. You glance west, toward Berlin, sensing a dawning realization. This is no lightning war. It is something else. A grinding, merciless struggle that will consume millions. And as you stamp your feet to keep warm, you can't help but wonder if the Wehrmacht has already sown the seeds of its own destruction in these frozen fields. You jolt awake in a canvas cot, the air heavy with the sweet, acrid tang of aviation fuel. Somewhere beyond the thin walls of your barracks, alarms wail across Pearl Harbor. For a heartbeat, you think it's another drill, some pre-breakfast exercise. Then the earth shudders under the first wave of Japanese bombs. You stumble outside into chaos. Black smoke billows skyward as battleships list and burn. Zero fighters swoop in low, their engines snarling like angry wasps. Mainstream historical fact: the attack begins at 7:48 a.m. on December 7, 1941, a date President Roosevelt will soon call a day which will live in infamy. All around you, sailors sprint across decks slick with water and oil. Anti-aircraft guns hammer the sky, sending tracers arching into nothing. You dive behind a stack of crates just as another bomb strikes the USS Arizona, erupting in a fireball that seems to swallow the sun. Historians still argue whether US intelligence could have pieced together enough clues to anticipate this assault. You suspect the truth is buried beneath layers of hubris, miscommunication, and the sheer arrogance that no one would dare strike America on its own soil. Quirky tidbit: in the confusion, some American pilots managed to get airborne in obsolete P-36 Hawks, so old their spare parts are almost impossible to find. But against all odds, they down several attackers. You can almost hear the incredulous laughter in their headsets as they score hits. By mid-morning, the harbor is a graveyard. You pick your way past twisted steel, the water thick with burning fuel. Survivors cling to floating debris, their faces streaked with soot and salt. A chaplain kneels beside a sailor pinned beneath wreckage, murmuring a prayer you can barely hear over the crackle of flames. Across the Pacific, the Japanese offensive unspools like a masterstroke. Guam falls within days. Wake Island mounts a valiant defense but succumbs before Christmas. In the Philippines, General MacArthur withdraws to Corregidor, vowing to return even as his forces retreat. You board a crowded troopship bound west, clutching a rifle that feels suddenly inadequate. As the coastline of Hawaii recedes, you wonder if you're sailing into the greatest conflict humanity has ever witnessed, or the last. In Washington, flags fly at half-staff. Congress declares war almost unanimously. Factories roar to life in a frenzy of production. Rosie the Riveter posters appear in every town, summoning women to weld hulls and rivet fuselages. You can almost taste the adrenaline sweeping the nation, a mix of fury and determination. Back in the Pacific, Japanese forces seize Hong Kong and sweep into Malaya. You slog through jungle trails on an island you've never heard of before this month, fighting an enemy who seems to appear out of the trees themselves. Quirky tidbit: Japanese soldiers sometimes carried cricket cages into the field, believing the insect song brought good luck. The sound mingles oddly with the rattle of machine gun fire. At sea, carriers replace battleships as the queens of naval warfare. You watch the USS Enterprise launch waves of dauntless dive bombers, their wings folding open as they plunge toward enemy decks. The old doctrines of naval strategy die under the impact of aerial torpedoes. Historians still debate whether Pearl Harbor truly doomed Japan by waking an industrial giant it could never defeat. You feel that giant stirring under your boots. America's factories, shipyards, and steel mills uniting into a war machine with no precedent. Even in the bleakest moments, a strange optimism smoulders among the troops. You sense that the tide will turn eventually, but the road there will be paved with ruin. As night falls on the Pacific, you stand watch on the deck of a destroyer, the stars overhead so clear it feels like you could pluck them from the sky. You grip the railing and wonder how many dawns it will take to push the war back across the ocean. You trudge down a narrow trail hacked through steamy jungle, the damp pressing in on every inch of your skin. This is the Pacific Theater's grim reality. Mosquitoes the size of thumbnails, mud that clings like cement, and an enemy who knows every ridge and hollow. It's 1942, and America is learning how to fight in this inferno. The first major counterattack unfolds on Guadalcanal, where you crouch behind a log, heart hammering, as shells burst among palm trees. Mainstream historical fact: Guadalcanal is the Allies' first significant offensive against Japan, and for 6 months it becomes the center of a grinding, desperate struggle. You watch Marines land under fire, wading ashore through chest-high surf. Supplies vanish almost as fast as they arrive. Everyone calls it Operation Shoestring, because logistics are as scarce as clean socks. Quirky tidbit: to keep morale up, troops invent outlandish nicknames, like Starvation Island, which is only a slight exaggeration. At night, you lie awake on your mat, listening to the drone of insects blending with the far-off rumble of naval guns. The Japanese make nightly attempts to retake Henderson Field, launching banzai charges you hear before you see, shrill whistles, then a crashing rush through the undergrowth. Historians still argue whether Japan underestimated the sheer determination of exhausted, malaria-stricken Marines. You spend dawn digging foxholes deeper, your fingers raw and blistered. The jungle seems to sprout corpses overnight, both friend and foe, half hidden beneath the ferns. Yet amid all this decay, life clings stubbornly. Tiny birds flit among shattered branches, and vines snake over scorched bunkers as if determined to reclaim them. From Guadalcanal, the campaign leaps across the Pacific. You board a transport bound for Tarawa, where the lagoon gleams deceptively turquoise under the midday sun. As you clamber down a landing craft ramp, machine gun fire tears the surf into white froth. The first waves of Marines wade hundreds of yards under constant fire. Some never make it past the reef. You find yourself crawling across coral sand so hot it blisters your palms. The air reeks of cordite and blood. Tarawa falls after 76 hours, at a cost that leaves even seasoned commanders shaken. Mainstream historical fact: nearly 1,000 US Marines die taking a single small atoll. After Tarawa, the island-hopping strategy gains momentum. You fight on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, each battle teaching you the same hard lesson. No scrap of territory comes cheap. On Saipan's cliffs, you watch civilians driven to jump rather than surrender, an image that will haunt you long after the war ends. At sea, the carrier battles redefine naval warfare. You stand on a flight deck at dawn, feeling the vibration as Hellcats launch toward the horizon. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, nicknamed the Great Mariner's Turkey Shoot, obliterates hundreds of Japanese planes in a single day. Quirky tidbit: pilots returning to their carriers can't resist tallying scores in chalk on the fuselage, some scribbling cartoons of turkeys in flight goggles. Historians still debate whether this battle marks the moment Japan's naval air power is truly broken beyond repair. You only know that when you next look out across the waves, you sense the tide turning at last. You press northward toward the Philippines, where General MacArthur fulfills his vow to return. You witness the surreal spectacle of his landing at Leyte Gulf, pipe clenched between his teeth as cameras click around him. The fighting that follows is anything but theatrical. Leyte becomes a grinding melee of jungle skirmishes, kamikaze attacks, and naval bombardments so fierce they rattle your fillings. You catch yourself counting the islands still ahead. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, perhaps even Japan itself. Each step is a little closer to victory, though it feels more like inching across an endless chessboard, one square at a time. As your ship pulls away from another conquered beach, you turn to watch the shoreline recede. For a moment, you almost pity the enemy soldiers left behind, their fanatical resolve now ashes in the jungle heat. But you know there will be no easy finish. Even here, where the horizon seems infinite, you can feel the war tightening into something final, something that will either end in total conquest or unimaginable devastation. You squint across a sun-bleached expanse of sand and rock, the wind whipping grit into your eyes. This is North Africa, an alien landscape of scorpions, stunted shrubs, and heat so fierce it feels like you're breathing inside an oven. It's early 1941, and you've just arrived in a theatre many call a sideshow, but which quickly becomes a proving ground for modern warfare. The Afrika Korps, Rommel's desert army, has landed to rescue Italy's faltering colonial ambitions. You watch columns of Panzer III tanks crest a ridge, sunlight glinting off their armor as though the desert itself has sprouted mechanized predators. Mainstream historical fact: the Afrika Korps is so efficient and audacious that Rommel earns the nickname the Desert Fox. His raids confound British commanders, who struggle to predict where he'll strike next. Historians still argue whether the British could have decisively crushed him if supplies and reinforcements had been allocated differently. You ride in the back of a Bedford lorry, passing convoys of trucks hauling fuel in jerry cans, lashed down with rope. Quirky tidbit: German troops paint palm trees on their vehicles, partly for camouflage and partly as a cheeky nod to their tropical posting. You can almost hear Rommel's laughter whenever his units vanish into the mirage before launching a fresh attack. Supply is everything here. You help unload crates of water and fuel under the glare of a North African noon. The sand burns your palms through the crate handles, and you learn fast that thirst can kill faster than any bullet. Battles sweep back and forth across the desert in a pattern as predictable as the tides and yet impossible to stop. You help build fortifications at Tobruk, that stubborn port the British cling to despite repeated German assaults. Each time Rommel surges forward, he's slowed by the dogged Australian and British garrison holding the fortress. One afternoon, you hunker down behind a sandberm as German artillery walks shells across your position. Dust clouds billow higher than a 2-story house. At night, tracer fire stitches the sky while you wait for the inevitable counterattack. The desert has a way of stripping war down to its basics. No shelter but what you dig. No cover but what you bring. You share a canteen with a Scottish infantryman who swears his kilt is cooler than any khaki uniform, though you suspect he just likes the stories it inspires. By late 1942, fortunes shift. The British Eighth Army, now under General Montgomery, amasses overwhelming force for a decisive blow. You feel the tension in the air at El Alamein, where thousands of tanks gather nose to nose. On the eve of battle, you walk among the camouflaged hulks, running your hand over the cold steel. Somewhere in the darkness, bagpipes start up, a sound so eerie in the vast silence that it sends a shiver down your spine. Mainstream historical fact: the Second Battle of El Alamein marks the turning point in North Africa. Rommel's offensive momentum is finally broken, and the Allies seize the initiative. You hear Churchill's voice over the radio, declaring that before Alamein, we never had a victory, and after it, we never had a defeat. In November, Operation Torch brings American troops to Morocco and Algeria. You wade ashore near Oran, wondering how long it will take to link up with Montgomery's men pushing west. Historians still debate whether Torch was necessary or simply a way to ease Soviet demands for a second front. The Axis forces begin a long, bitter retreat. You trail Rommel's battered columns through Tunisia, where supply lines finally collapse. One by one, German and Italian strongpoints fall under the weight of Allied superiority in men, tanks, and fuel. Quirky tidbit: during the final battles, some German soldiers disguise their tanks with palm fronds. One last desperate trick in a campaign that has already inspired countless desert legends. By May 1943, you stand on a hillside overlooking the remnants of the Afrika Korps surrendering en masse. Dust devils whirl across the abandoned trenches. You can hardly believe that just months ago, this army seemed unstoppable. As you sling your rifle and turn toward the sea, you sense that North Africa was only the prelude. Ahead lies Europe itself, a continent waiting for liberation, and a showdown with fascism in its lair. You slip through the doorway of a darkened farmhouse, the floorboards creaking under your boots. Somewhere in the cellar below, a radio sputters out coded messages in a language you don't understand, but have come to recognize as lifelines. This is occupied Europe, a continent of shadows and whispered defiance. It's 1943, and as German armies extend their reach, ordinary people decide they will not bow quietly. Mainstream historical fact: resistance movements spring up across every occupied nation: France, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland. you're here to witness their ingenuity and their staggering courage. By day, you move among civilians trying to look inconspicuous. By night, you watch as the same people unearth hidden weapons, sabotage trains, and pass messages hand to hand. In Paris, you linger near a cafe where the owner slips intelligence reports into baguettes, destined for Allied handlers. Historians still argue whether these networks shortened the war by months, or merely kept hope alive while armies did the heavy lifting. You travel to Poland, where the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising erupts in April. The ghetto, already a prison, becomes a battlefield, as Jewish fighters armed with smuggled pistols and Molotov cocktails resist Nazi liquidation squads. You hear the rattle of automatic fire echo down the narrow streets, the cries of the trapped, the roar of flamethrowers consuming entire buildings. Quirky tidbit: in Norway, resistance members perfect a chemical mixture called Vemork Special to sabotage heavy water production, a vital component in Germany's nuclear ambitions. You can almost see the saboteurs sneaking up the icy cliffs, carrying explosives in burlap sacks. Not all resistance is armed. You meet a librarian in Amsterdam who hides Jewish families behind shelves of false books. A schoolteacher in Greece who maps German positions in invisible ink. A Dutch housewife who simply refuses to register her newborn child, so the occupiers can't track her family. Each act feels like a small pebble hurled at a tank, but together they become something larger. A reminder that submission is never universal, no matter how brutal the conqueror. You help guide downed Allied pilots through the Comet Line, an escape route from Belgium through France to neutral Spain. At one safe house, you share stale bread with an RAF sergeant who still clutches the charred stub of a good luck charm. He grins, teeth white in the gloom, and whispers that he's already planning his next sortie once he gets home. Mainstream historical fact: more than 2,000 airmen are smuggled along these secret paths, relying on a chain of volunteers who risk execution if caught. Historians still debate whether the Germans ever truly grasped the scale of these networks. You witness sabotage that seems straight out of a spy novel. Railway switches jammed with wedges of wood. Telegraph lines severed under moonless skies. Convoys delayed just long enough that Allied bombers catch them exposed. Quirky tidbit: in occupied Denmark, resistance members sometimes placed itching powder inside German uniform shipments, sparking days of scratching and embarrassment. And there are the coded broadcasts, BBC transmissions read in a calm voice, slipping cryptic phrases into weather reports. The hedgehog sings at dawn can mean a weapons drop is imminent. You catch yourself holding your breath every time the radio crackles to life. Yet the cost is staggering. You attend a dawn execution in Prague, forced to watch as partisans are shot against a brick wall. A small boy clutches his mother's skirt, eyes blank. You think you'll never forget that expression. Historians still argue whether such reprisals crushed local morale or fueled an even deeper resolve to resist. From what you see, every fresh atrocity plants another seed of defiance. By the end of 1943, Allied leaders finally begin coordinating large-scale support. Supply drops, weapons deliveries, intelligence sharing. In the distance, you sense an approaching storm. The invasion everyone knows must come. And as you leave the safe house one last time, you look back at the radio's faint glow and think about all the people who have no uniforms, no ranks, and no medals, yet who fight with a quiet ferocity that armies would envy. You trudge along a frozen street where 1,000 windows stare blankly into the darkness. This is Leningrad, and you can feel the siege in your marrow. Hunger, cold, and an endless drumbeat of artillery echoing across the Neva River. September 1941 marks the beginning of the blockade. German and Finnish forces encircle the city, determined to starve it into submission. Mainstream historical fact: Leningrad endures nearly 900 days under siege, making it one of the longest and most harrowing in history. You duck into an apartment stairwell to escape a shell burst. The air inside is stale, and every surface seems to shimmer with frost. A woman sits on the landing, a loaf of bread cradled in her lap like a newborn. The ration card pinned to her coat is worn thin, soft as old linen. Quirky tidbit: to stretch rations, bakers mix sawdust into bread, a gritty compromise between nourishment and desperation. You bite off a corner and feel splinters scrape your tongue. At night, you wrap yourself in every scrap of cloth you can find. The thermometer dips past -30. You wake to find your breath frozen on your scarf. A pot of water left near the stove solidifies into ice before dawn. Historians still argue whether the city could have been evacuated in time. Stalin forbids retreat. Leningrad must stand as a symbol. And so it does, but the price is staggering. Each day is a negotiation between survival and surrender. You help bury the dead in shallow graves along the avenues, the ground too frozen to dig properly. Bodies are carried on sleds past lines of silent mourners. You think you'll never grow used to the sight, but eventually, numbness takes hold. The shelling never stops. You huddle in a basement with a family of strangers. Each time the walls shudder, dust drifts from the ceiling in a soft, relentless rain. Mainstream historical fact: by the siege's end, an estimated 1 million civilians perish, more from starvation and exposure than enemy fire. Yet somehow, life persists. Children gather to rehearse a play in a ruined theatre, their voices faint but determined. You stand in the back row, clapping with gloved hands, as if it's the Bolshoi itself. You witness small acts of defiance so brave they almost break your heart. A librarian opens her reading room every day despite the shell holes in the roof. An old violinist plays concerts broadcast over loudspeakers, each note a whisper of dignity against the roar of guns. Quirky tidbit: when composer Dmitri Shostakovich completes his 7th symphony, the manuscript is smuggled out for performance abroad, becoming a rallying cry for resistance. But here, within the city, musicians perform it live in August 1942. Some so weak they must be propped up in their chairs. As the months pass, you become part of the city's grim rhythm. Lines for food, funerals, water, firewood. The ration trucks rumble over Lake Ladoga, the road of life, a fragile ice highway that links Leningrad to the outside world. Each crossing is a gamble. You see more than one truck vanish into black water beneath cracking ice. Historians still debate whether the siege broke or steeled Soviet resolve. From what you see, every day the city endures becomes a living rebuke to the idea that terror can conquer the human spirit. You mark the seasons by which trees still stand in the parks and how many inches of bark remain to be stripped for fuel. By the second winter, most wooden furniture has been burned. The library's gutted for anything that will fit in a stove. When relief finally comes, January 1944, the breaking of the blockade feels almost surreal. The artillery falls silent, and a hush spreads across the city like dawn after a nightmare. You watch a convoy of Red Army trucks crawl across the ice road, loaded with flour and medicine, and you understand that survival here is not victory, but something older and more sacred. Proof that endurance itself is a form of defiance. And as you walk through the thawing streets, you think of all the voices stilled, all the stories left unfinished, and you promise yourself you'll remember them Long after the guns have gone quiet, you feel the cold wind whip across the deck of a landing ship as it lurches through the grey swells of the English Channel. Around you, thousands of men clutch rifles, rosaries, and private fears. It's June 5th, 1944, the night before D-Day, and you can taste the anticipation like salt on your lips. In the pre-dawn gloom, General Eisenhower's voice crackles over loudspeakers, telling you this is the Great Crusade. Mainstream historical fact: Operation Overlord will be the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted, a logistical marvel involving over 150,000 Allied troops, 5,000 ships, and nearly 12,000 aircraft. Historians still argue whether German defences, Rommel's Atlantic Wall, are as impregnable as Nazi propaganda claims. You suspect you'll find out soon enough. Hours later, you clamber down a cargo net into a landing craft bouncing on the swell. The engine's roar is deafening. The shoreline grows from a blur into a solid wall of cliffs and gun emplacements. Overhead, paratroopers drift down behind enemy lines, their canopies pale blossoms in the dawn sky. Then the ramp slams open, and you wade into a maelstrom. Machine guns rake the surf. Artillery blossoms in towering geysers. You hunch behind a steel obstacle, heart hammering so loud you can barely hear the shouted orders. Quirky tidbit: some soldiers carried inflatable rubber Mae West life vests, named after the curvy movie star, because wearing them supposedly made you look as buxom as she did. You suspect nobody feels much like a film idol right now. Omaha Beach is chaos. You help drag a wounded radio operator behind a sand dune as bullets snap overhead. For hours, the outcome seems balanced on a knife's edge. Pockets of infantry pinned down, tanks bogged in sand, smoke drifting so thick you can't see your own hands. Mainstream historical fact: by nightfall, the beachhead holds. It's a slender, precarious victory bought with nearly 10,000 Allied casualties. You spend the hours after dusk digging a foxhole with trembling hands, wondering how you survived. Over the next days, the invasion spreads inland. You slog through hedgerows dense as fortresses, Normandy's infamous bocage. Each field is a potential ambush. German snipers lurk in haylofts. Artillery zeroes in on every crossroad. You watch Sherman tanks try to force a path through the tangle, only to bog down again and again. Historians still debate whether Allied planners underestimated the difficulty of fighting in this claustrophobic countryside. You sleep in brief snatches under canvas, waking to the drone of Luftwaffe night raids. Supplies pour ashore, ammunition, rations, jeeps, while fresh troops arrive to feed the expanding front. Quirky tidbit: American engineers construct entire artificial harbours, mulberries, floating piers anchored offshore so cargo ships can unload without a port. You walk out onto one, amazed it stays afloat under the pounding surf. By July, the breakout begins. Operation Cobra unleashes a carpet of bombs that tears German lines apart near St. Lo. You crawl forward in the dawn haze, past wrecked tanks and stunned survivors. The German army reels, retreating toward the Seine. You catch fleeting glimpses of liberation. Villagers weeping as American columns roll through, women hugging GIs, children waving tricolour flags they've hidden for years. But there's no time to savour the moment. The push must go on. Mainstream historical fact: within weeks, Paris is free. You arrive as columns of free French troops enter the city, the boulevards thronged with cheering crowds. For a moment, the war feels almost finished, but you know better. Historians still argue whether the German retreat was a tactical withdrawal or a rout. You see plenty of evidence for the latter. Abandoned vehicles, panicked prisoners, command posts left in such haste they forgot their maps. Quirky tidbit. As Paris celebrates, American MPs scramble to control the influx of journalists, politicians, and even movie stars eager to witness liberation firsthand. One reporter complains that the front line now has more press badges than bullets. As August draws to a close, you stand on a bridge over the Seine, watching the sun sink behind Notre Dame's silhouette. You're exhausted, exhilarated, and aware that the final battles still lie ahead, deeper into Germany itself. And as the first cool nights of autumn settle over liberated France, you shoulder your rifle again, bracing for whatever comes next, because you know the war won't end until the Reich itself is in ruins, and every camp, every prison, every occupied street is free. You trudge along a churned-up road under a sky as grey as old canvas. The Ardennes forest rises around you, bare trees etched black against drifting snow. It's December 1944, and you're about to walk straight into Hitler's last gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. Mainstream historical fact: the German offensive begins in the early hours of December 16th, a surprise assault that punches a 50-mile-wide wedge into the Allied front. Thousands of shells howl over your head as panzers pour into Belgium and Luxembourg. At first, nobody believes the scale of the attack. You hear officers mutter that it's a local counterattack, nothing more. But by nightfall, whole divisions are in retreat. You watch convoys of half-frozen GIs backtracking through knee-deep drifts, headlights taped over to avoid drawing artillery fire. Quirky tidbit: in their rush to break through, German columns sometimes captured American fuel dumps, but lacked the maps to find more supplies. Fuel, not manpower, will soon strangle the offensive. You dig into a shallow foxhole outside Bastogne, a Belgian crossroads town that becomes a symbol of stubborn resistance. Snow seeps through your gloves, numbing your fingers. In the darkness, you listen to tank engines growl and the far-off bark of machine guns. By Christmas, the 101st Airborne Division is encircled. You help drag ammunition crates into ruined buildings as medics treat wounded men by candlelight. Food is scarce, warmth scarcer still, and yet nobody talks of surrender. Historians still argue whether the Germans ever had a real chance to split the Allies and seize Antwerp. From your vantage point, it feels like the last desperate throw of a gambler who's already lost. On December 22nd, a German officer approaches under a white flag to demand Bastogne's surrender. Brigadier General McAuliffe replies with a single word: nuts. The story spreads through the ranks like wildfire, and you find yourself laughing for the first time in days. Mainstream historical fact: Patton's Third Army fights through blizzards to relieve Bastogne on December 26th, linking up with the exhausted defenders. You watch his lead tanks grind into the square, their hulls rimed with ice, the crews waving from the turrets. Relief brings no rest. The counterattack begins at once. You slog through drifts so deep they swallow your boots, trying to pry the Germans back from their temporary gains. For weeks, the Ardennes becomes a frozen charnel house. Quirky tidbit: to confuse Allied forces, German commandos in American uniforms infiltrate behind the lines, switching road signs and sowing panic. The ruse is so effective that GIs start quizzing each other on baseball trivia to prove they're not imposters. Each village becomes a bitter fight. You advance past splintered barns and wrecked jeeps, the snow stained rust brown with blood and oil. The cold is the worst enemy of all. Rifle bolts freeze, rations turn to bricks. You sleep in brief snatches, wrapped in whatever blankets you can scrounge. Historians still debate whether the Ardennes offensive delayed the Allied advance enough to prolong the war by months. You suspect it only hastened Germany's collapse by burning through irreplaceable reserves. By mid-January, the salient is erased. You march east through a forest littered with burnt-out panzers, their hulks half buried in snowdrifts. The German army, once so confident, is now bleeding from 1,000 cuts. Mainstream historical fact: the Battle of the Bulge is the largest battle fought by the US Army in World War II. Over 1 million men take part. You feel like you've aged 10 years in those freezing weeks. When the last German units retreat, you stand on a ridge and look back over the wreckage. Villages flattened, trees snapped like matchsticks, the silence broken only by the creak of ice. Quirky tidbit: in the aftermath, GIs scrawl graffiti on abandoned German vehicles, some triumphant, some weary, all relieved that the worst of winter is finally ending. And as you shoulder your rifle, you sense that the end is close. Beyond the horizon lies Germany itself. Cities that will soon burn, camps waiting to be liberated, and a reckoning no one can yet fully imagine. You take a deep breath of the icy air and step forward, determined that whatever comes next, you will see it through to the finish. You march under leaden skies toward the Rhine, past villages where the walls are pocked with bullet holes and every crossroad smells of diesel and spent cordite. It's the spring of 1945, and you can feel the Third Reich unraveling by the hour. Mainstream historical fact: as Allied armies surge into Western Germany, Soviet forces are driving from the east in a pincer that will crush Berlin. You hear rumors of entire German divisions surrendering rather than face annihilation. One dawn, you reach Remagen and gape at the Ludendorff Bridge, still standing against all odds. Engineers rush to secure it as German artillery rains down. You sprint across the steel span, half expecting it to collapse with each footstep. But you make it to the far bank, lungs burning. Quirky tidbit: the bridge survives 10 days of near-constant bombardment before finally falling into the river. By then, thousands of Allied troops have poured across, establishing the first foothold on the Rhine's east bank. From there, the advance becomes a rolling thunder. You pass refugee columns shuffling west, carts piled with featherbeds and broken clocks. German soldiers, some barely teenagers, stagger forward to surrender. You search their eyes for defiance, but find only exhaustion. Historians still argue whether Hitler's insistence on fighting to the last accelerated Germany's ruin, or merely prolonged inevitable defeat. You suspect it did both. In the Ruhr, you witness the encirclement of hundreds of thousands of German troops, an entire army group trapped like insects under glass. The air smells of wet canvas and diesel fumes. You watch columns of POWs stretch beyond the horizon, weapons discarded in ditches. Mainstream historical fact: the Ruhr pocket yields over 300,000 prisoners in a single stroke. For the first time, you glimpse an end to the slaughter. But the deeper you push into Germany, the stranger the war feels. Towns surrender without a fight. Villagers hang white sheets from windows, trembling as your patrols pass. You liberate barns stuffed with looted artwork and crates stamped with swastikas. Quirky tidbit: Allied intelligence units dispatch monuments men to track down stolen masterpieces. Paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer and Da Vinci, hidden in salt mines and castles. You see one officer weep with relief when he unpacks a rolled-up canvas he thought was lost forever. As you approach the Elbe River, the scale of German collapse becomes surreal. Locomotives still puff along the rails, carrying Wehrmacht detachments toward a front that no longer exists. Civilians stream in all directions, some fleeing the Soviets, others just trying to survive. One afternoon, you help liberate a camp near Weimar. You step through the gates, past the sign reading Jedem da Sene, to each his own. Inside you find the emaciated survivors of Buchenwald. They watch you with hollow eyes, too weak to cheer. Mainstream historical fact: American forces liberate Buchenwald on April 11, 1945. The sight of the camp will haunt you longer than any battle. Historians still debate whether ordinary Germans truly understood what happened in these camps. As you help lift skeletal bodies onto stretchers, you think the truth was always there for anyone willing to see. You cross the Elbe and meet Soviet patrols advancing from the east. In the no-man's land between your lines, you share cigarettes and cautious nods with Russian soldiers in dusty uniforms. No words are needed. You all know the war is nearly over. Quirky tidbit: at the Elbe's banks, American and Soviet troops trade souvenirs, helmets, medals, even pistols. Some GIs scribble their names on the buttstocks of Mosin Nagant rifles to remember the day they shook hands with their allies. Everywhere you look, the Reich is collapsing into itself. Radio broadcasts blare frantic orders nobody obeys. Cities burn. Whole units surrender with barely a shot fired. You hear Hitler's voice, thin, desperate, on the radio, promising vengeance no one believes in anymore. As April draws to an end, you stand in a village square, watching civilians tear down swastika banners with a quiet determination. You can feel something vast and terrible finally dying, and you realize that even victory carries its own grief. So many friends lost, so many places reduced to ash. But at least you know the fighting is nearly finished, and the world might finally exhale after 6 years of horror. You stand in the rubble-strewn heart of Berlin, the air thick with smoke and the acrid tang of cordite. This is the endgame, April 1945, and the city trembles beneath the bombardment of thousands of Soviet artillery pieces. Mainstream historical fact: more than 1 million Soviet troops converge on the German capital, determined to crush the last defences of the Third Reich. Historians still argue whether the Western Allies could have reached Berlin first, if Eisenhower hadn't prioritized the southern thrust. You pick your way down a boulevard lined with shattered facades. The Brandenburg Gate looms through the haze, its columns pitted and scorched. Everywhere, soldiers crouch behind barricades, firing into shadows. German boys barely old enough to shave dart from doorways, with Panzerfaust clutched to their chests. You duck as a shell lands nearby, spraying cobblestones across the square. For a moment, you think your heart will never slow again. Then you force yourself to stand and keep moving. Quirky tidbit: in the final days, Berlin's defenders issue medals stamped from aluminum, salvaged from downed Allied bombers. A bitter irony: honours minted from defeat. Inside the Reich Chancellery's tunnels, Hitler broods over maps that mean nothing anymore. You hear whispered rumours he has married Eva Braun and prepared his final orders. By the time you cross the Spree River, he is already dead. A bullet to the head, a body burned in a garden crater. Mainstream historical fact: Hitler commits suicide on April 30th, 1945. The news trickles through German ranks like a dying ember. Some units fight on out of desperation. Others crumble at once. You watch Soviet troops raise the red flag over the Reichstag, a moment destined to be etched in every history book. The photo will become a symbol of Nazi defeat. But standing there, you feel no triumph, only exhaustion. In the days that follow, Berlin becomes a morbid carnival of surrender. Civilians stumble from cellars, pale and hollow-eyed. German officers approach with white flags or trembling hands held high. You help disarm them, stacking rifles and submachine guns in neat rows that feel absurdly tidy amid the wreckage. Quirky tidbit: Some Soviets celebrate victory by carving their names into the walls of the Reichstag in Cyrillic graffiti, still visible decades later as an accidental monument. Historians still debate whether Germany could have negotiated a separate peace before the city fell. From what you've seen, the regime's death wish was too absolute to allow for compromise. At night, the fires throw orange light over the skyline. You walk past craters big enough to swallow a truck, the streets choked with debris. A black cat watches you from the top of a broken lamppost, its eyes catching the flames. In the Tiergarten, tanks stand abandoned, their crews gone or dead. You find yourself staring at the ruined zoo tower, where die-hard SS units held out for days, firing down into the park. Mainstream historical fact: over 70,000 Soviet soldiers die taking Berlin. More than 100,000 German civilians perish in the siege. You wonder how many more names will never be known. You help process columns of POWs, some silent, some pleading in broken English. The faces blur together. The old men, the young boys, the soldiers who no longer care who sees them cry. On May 2nd, Berlin finally surrenders. You stand in the bombed-out streets, listening to the sudden quiet. No gunfire, no shouting, just the wind sifting through the ash. Quirky tidbit: when Soviet troops announce victory over loudspeakers, some Berliners are so numb they keep hiding in their cellars for days, unable to believe it's over. You walk to the Reich Chancellery's garden, where a burned patch of earth marks the end of an empire. For all the horror and waste, this place feels strangely small, just another courtyard littered with rubble. And as you watch the Soviet columns roll past, you feel a surge of relief so sharp it nearly doubles you over. The war in Europe is done. The reckoning has come at last. But in the Pacific, you know, the final chapters are still unwritten. And before the world can breathe again, more fire will fall from the sky. You step onto the sun-baked tarmac of an island airfield, the Pacific wind stirring the cuffs of your uniform. It's July 1945, and the last battles rage thousands of miles from Berlin's ruins. The war here has taken on a relentless, grinding rhythm. An island seized, another prepared for assault, casualties mounting like a grim arithmetic. Mainstream historical fact: Iwo Jima fell in March, after more than a month of brutal combat that killed over 20,000 Japanese defenders and nearly 7,000 Americans. You walk past a row of Marine helmets balanced on rifles, each marking a man who won't see home again. You board a transport headed for Okinawa, the largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War. As you approach, the island looks deceptively green and peaceful. But the moment you land, mortars and machine guns erupt from hidden positions. You dive for cover behind a low wall, heart thudding. Okinawa becomes an ordeal that dwarfs everything before it. For nearly 3 months, you slog through mud, monsoon rains, and unrelenting Japanese resistance. Historians still argue whether the ferocity of this battle convinced American planners that an invasion of Japan itself would be catastrophic. Quirky tidbit: on Okinawa, some US soldiers improvise rain skirts from parachute silk, wrapping them around their legs to keep from sinking knee-deep in the endless muck. It doesn't help much. You pass caves packed with civilians, women, children, elders, some too terrified to surrender. Leaflets flutter down promising safety, but fear proves stronger than hunger. One morning, you witness a line of civilians walking slowly toward your lines, their faces blank with exhaustion. As April bleeds into May, casualties climb past all predictions. You lose count of the friends you bury. Each ridge feels like the last until you crest it and see yet another rise ahead, bristling with pillboxes and hidden guns. Mainstream historical fact. By June 22nd, Okinawa is declared secure. Over 12,000 Americans have died, and more than 100,000 Japanese troops and civilians are dead or missing. You feel as if the island itself is mourning. In the aftermath, you hear rumors of something unimaginable, a weapon so powerful it can end the war in a single stroke. Historians still debate whether the decision was inevitable, or whether the blockade and firebombing alone would have forced surrender. You're flown to Tinian, an airfield buzzing with activity. You see B-29 bombers being prepared, massive silvery machines gleaming in the island sun. One is called Enola Gay. You watch it lift off on August 6th, carrying its secret cargo toward Hiroshima. Quirky tidbit: the bomb is so heavy that the plane's tires are replaced with specially reinforced versions, and the aircrew receives a crash course in emergency procedures should they fail to clear the blast radius. 3 days later, a second bomb falls on Nagasaki. The radio reports casualties in numbers that don't sound real. Tens of thousands dead in moments. You stare at the horizon, unable to imagine such destruction compressed into a heartbeat. Mainstream historical fact. Japan announces surrender on August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles across the airwaves, telling his people to endure the unendurable. You never thought you'd hear that phrase spoken aloud. As the weeks pass, you help oversee the first waves of occupation troops landing on Japanese soil. You expect resistance but find mostly stunned silence. Streets are lined with people bowing low, eyes fixed on the ground. You stand in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, watching the surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri. General MacArthur reads his statement with the solemnity of a funeral, and Japanese officials step forward to sign the instrument of surrender. Quirky tidbit: some American sailors lean so far over the rails to glimpse the ceremony that their commanding officers have to bark orders to keep them from tumbling into the water. Historians still argue whether the bombings saved millions of lives or opened a Pandora's box that can never be closed. You only know that for the first time in years, the world is quiet. As you disembark onto Japanese soil, you look back across the water. The battles are over, the reckoning has come, and now, somehow, humanity must learn to live with the weapons it has unleashed. And as you walk into the occupied city, you feel the weight of all you've witnessed. So much loss, so much resilience, and hope that the price paid will never have to be paid again. You stand among the ruins of Yokohama, the breeze lifting charred scraps of newspaper along a silent street. Japan has surrendered, but the war lingers in every collapsed wall, every face you pass, hollow with hunger and relief and the shock of having survived. Mainstream historical fact: over 60 million people perished in World War II. Historians still argue whether any conflict before or since has reshaped humanity so completely. You walk past children gathering twigs to cook what little rice remains. Women bow low as your patrol passes, their eyes never lifting from the dust. For a moment, you remember Paris crowds cheering liberation, Berliners hanging white flags, and the quiet surrender on a Pacific shore, and you feel the enormity of it settle into your bones. Quirky tidbit: in the first months of occupation, US troops distribute chewing gum and chocolate bars, which quickly become prized commodities in the black market and symbols of an entirely new world arriving on Japan's doorstep. At the ports, ships offload supplies, grain, medical equipment, crates stamped with red crosses, and you help organize the relief. You're used to destruction by now, but not this sudden pivot toward rebuilding. You climb the steps of a shattered temple, pausing at the threshold, where a bronze Buddha sits serenely amid rubble. A shaft of sunlight catches the statue's worn features, and you feel an unexpected surge of hope. Even here, something endures. Mainstream historical fact. General MacArthur leads the occupation, overseeing disarmament, democratization, and the prosecution of war crimes. You attend one of the early tribunals in Tokyo, watching former generals stand in the dock, once titans of an empire, now gaunt figures in ill-fitting suits. Historians still debate whether these trials were perfect justice or imperfect necessity. But as you listen to the charges read aloud, atrocities that defy belief, you think accountability, however flawed, matters more than perfection. You help dismantle weapons caches hidden in rural depots, collect rifles from resigned soldiers, supervise the destruction of munitions. One day, you stumble on a warehouse full of katanas stacked like firewood, symbols of a warrior caste that no longer exists. Quirky tidbit. Many Japanese officers surrender their swords to Allied troops as formal gestures of defeat. Some blades are centuries old, passed down through samurai families, each one carrying its own quiet history. In the evenings, you join your comrades in makeshift barracks, half-wrecked schools or warehouses swept clean enough to sleep in. You drink bitter coffee from tin mugs, write letters home you're never sure how to begin. Outside, life insists on returning. Children play beside bomb craters. Shops reopen behind patched windows. Rice paddies sprout fresh green rows, as if the earth itself is trying to forget the firestorms that scoured it bare. Mainstream historical fact. On September 2nd, 1945, when Japan formally surrenders, the Second World War ends in name. But you sense that for millions, it will take years, maybe lifetimes, to end in spirit. You meet a Buddhist priest tending a garden behind his temple. He bows deeply, then gestures to a cluster of chrysanthemums pushing up through cracked stone. He says a single word in English, peace. Historians still argue whether the lessons of this war can ever truly be learned. You look back on 6 years of unimaginable loss and wonder if humanity is capable of remembering or doomed to repeat the same mistakes in new forms. Quirky tidbit. Allied censors in occupied Japan review every letter home to ensure no sensitive details leak out. Even in peace, secrecy lingers. As winter approaches, you prepare to go home. You stand on a pier watching cargo ships load out, the rising sun bright on the water. You think of Normandy's cliffs, North Africa's dunes, Berlin's burning skyline, and the millions who never made it this far. And you realize that in the quiet that follows a war, survival can feel almost miraculous, almost impossible. Wind down, 300 words. Now the guns are silent. The banners are folded away, the medals packed into drawers, the uniforms set aside. You feel the world exhaling for the first time in years. A hush settles over the oceans and continents, as though every nation is pausing to count the cost of what has been done and what has been lost. You close your eyes and remember the faces of those you met. The girl in Leningrad clutching a crust of bread, the paratrooper grinning in a Normandy orchard, the sailor on Okinawa sketching home on a scrap of canvas. Their stories echo in your thoughts, a chorus of resilience and sorrow that refuses to fade. You take a slow, deep breath and let the memories drift past like autumn leaves. The world feels fragile now, but also astonishingly alive, as if each sunrise is proof that no darkness lasts forever. And as you settle deeper into your blankets, you picture the chrysanthemums blooming behind that ruined temple, bright and stubborn in the cold wind. You think of the word the priest offered, peace, and you let it fill your mind, soft and steady, until the last of the night's images melt away. Tonight, you have traveled far, You have witnessed the worst and the best of humanity. Now, all that remains is rest. Good night. Sleep well. The war is over.